The new Archbishop of Canterbury, this Dame Sarah Mullally, was in the news because during her ceremony at St. Paul's in London, a heckler screamed out when they said, "Does anyone have any objections?"
And that no person has appeared in opposition to the confirmation.
At weddings and also at the ordination of clergy and at the ordination of bishops, there is this phrase: if you've got no reason why we shouldn't do this, tell us. One of the questions from Mullally is she administratively competent, in the very least in terms of safeguarding?
The last Archbishop of Canterbury is removed for a lack of safeguarding, and the new one being put in, let's forget the other reasons, we'll get to those, has just a reckless record when it comes to safeguarding. This is actually preposterous.
Paul Williamson was saying she didn't at all. She was actually seriously responsible in part for this man's death. So what on earth is the institution doing, promoting her to the highest office when she isn't competent?
So now she's been in the top of the secular world and the top of the church. And the first thing she says is, we have a serious problem with misogyny.
It's presumed that you have a level of theological and intellectual competence and expertise, which means you've got at least an undergraduate degree, ideally 1 or 2 postgraduate degrees, preferably a PhD. The way she trained for the Church of England was part-time. She trained in night school. She did 2 evenings a week of theology for a couple of years. This is about as theology light as you could ever get. She hasn't got any qualifications for any of this. So then they made her Bishop of London. How has she done? Well, people think she's not done very well. Now they're going to make her Archbishop of Canterbury. I mean, it's hard to find the polite kind of language, really.
I read that Rwanda and Nigeria have declared spiritual independence now from the Church of England. What on earth do these bishops in the Church of England think they're going to accomplish? And maybe the answer is they don't think they're going to accomplish anything. Maybe they're just committing suicide.
They won't see the organization as destroyed. They'll see it as captured. And it doesn't matter how successful it is. They've captured it. That's what they set out to do. That's what matters.
And it really stuck in my mind as here is a wonderful priest at Liverpool Cathedral, and he can no longer wear his collar walking through the streets of Liverpool. And he told me that the Church of England was fading, attendance was fading, and when I looked up recently, it said less than 1% in England, less than 1% attend weekly services. But the king, as we know here, is the head of the Church of England. What is his take on all of this? Where is he standing? Because it seems every time I check the news, he's at another Islamic celebration or Muslim celebration or doing something else. I never see him at a Christian event.
Well, you can give him credit for being consistent. Mass migration is quite clearly a strategy driven by the elites to de-Christianize Europe.
Hello, everyone. This is Justin Kurian here at Reclaiming Christendom with my highly esteemed colleague. Please.
Well, I'm Gavin, but I'm not as well known as Justin, so I have to put my surname on because only celebrity authors are known by their first name, and I'm just trying to keep up.
Well, I have about 3 or 4 people who read my novels, and they're really enjoying them, though. They do enjoy them, so that's a good thing.
I loved your novel. I really want people to advertise your novel. I've forgotten the title of it. It's a day in the life of Ibiza. Or what's the real title?
Canticle of Ibiza. You of all people should know the Canticle. You of all
yes,
people.
The Canticle. Absolutely, I should.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to say in the news here in the United States, the Church of England is not that well known. People generally know it's the state church. In England, we don't have a state church here. We know you have a state church. But lately in the news, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, this Dame Sarah Mullally, was in the news because during her ceremony at St. Paul's in London, a heckler screamed out when they said, "Does anyone have any objections?" And I found that really, really entertaining, to be honest with you. And I wanted your take on that.
Endorsed on this mandate is a certificate which verifies that public notice was duly given as required, and that no person has appeared in opposition to the confirmation.
It's a hugely entertaining moment. There was a show over here called The Vicar of Dibley, which involved propaganda for women priests, and a very funny comedian, a large, ample lady called Dawn French was the vicar. And one of the best episodes was when she did a wedding, because in the Church of England's liturgy, there's a moment where the minister has to say, if there's any objection, speak now or hold your peace. Into this wedding comes a lady and makes an objection. He's married already. They turn around. Oh, wrong wedding, she says, and out she goes. But it's because at weddings and also at the ordination of clergy and at the ordination of bishops, there is this phrase: if you've got no reason why we shouldn't do this, tell us. So everyone has assumed it's a real question, not a rhetorical one. But it was treated when Mullally's election was ratified as rhetorical, because someone stood up and said, I object. And then he began to explain why, and he was closed down and hustled out of the cathedral. His name's Paul Williamson. He's a retired Anglican clergyman, and he began to object when they started ordaining women as bishops, saying that the church's articles don't allow it. But the objection here was much more serious, because I reported it in an article that I wrote about it. And he wrote to me saying, Gavin, you haven't understood the seriousness with which I was objecting. This wasn't objecting just to Mullally on the basis of her sex. Actually, I was protesting for a dead priest whose suicide she's partly responsible for. And I remember having read about it, but it just never really broke surface at all properly. So somebody sent it to me, and I wrote a second article putting the facts, and the facts are horrendous. We might look at them, but the principle is this: Justin Welby had to resign because it turns out he couldn't do safeguarding. He couldn't make the organization safe for people. And so one of the questions for Mullally is she administratively competent, in the very least in terms of safeguarding? Is she at least better than Justin Welby? Well, those who've been following Anglican politics know that there are several questions hanging over her head. The inside gossip or received wisdom is she's not terribly clever, not very personable, and actually has made a mess of a number of crises. Well, the crisis she made most of a mess of was when a report was given to the diocese by somebody who had responsibility for the diocese. In it contained a huge amount of misinformation, gossip, scurrilous defamation. And as a consequence, when it was leaked, one of the more vulnerable clergy killed himself. And the question was, what role did Mullally play in this? We might look at it depending on how much detail you want to go into. And did she come up with clean hands? And the answer, and so the man was protesting, Paul Williamson was saying, she didn't at all. She was actually seriously responsible in part for this man's death through her maladministration and her bad safeguarding. And for that reason, he was objecting. There was a second reason that he was objecting. He tried very hard to write into the central administration of the Church of England to make the objection on paper before it ever happened, saying you can't continue with this process because her reputation is so flawed and here's the evidence. And he was then involved in a kind of game of cat and mouse with the administrators, who acknowledged his letter and didn't reply to it. And he wrote back again. There was a delay. There was another delay, and they said, you're out of time this time because the king has mandated the appointment. And Paul Williamson said, well, when I first began corresponding, you didn't tell me there was a time limit. You didn't tell me it was contingent on the king doing it. And they said, yes, there's an arcane law, a piece of legislation, which in terms of the Archbishop of Canterbury means once the king has signed the thing, there are no objections admissible. And he said, well, even if that is the case in statute, you tell me it is, I have to believe it. Why isn't this publicized? This should be information that's accessible to anybody. If you're serious in saying that if the question, are there any objections, is not just rhetorical, why don't I know? Why didn't you tell me? Why did you play with me and delay me? And why are you now refusing to take seriously what I'm writing to you? So having done all that, he was also protesting about the fact that the church was unwilling or unable to abide by its own rhetoric and accept a protest of any kind. And it seemed to me that he had a very good case.
Yeah, and I think it's ironic as you bring up that Welby was removed, or he resigned due to a dearth of safeguarding acumen, let's say. And I also read an article about Dame Sarah Mullally that there was multiple cases with sexual harassment where she failed as the Bishop of London, including one case where she directly confronted the priest accused of sexual abuse, which she should not do. And that priest went after the complainant in private and started harassing the complainant to do that. I mean, everybody knows that's 101. You don't do that. And as the Bishop of London, she was doing this. So it is really ironic that the last Archbishop of Canterbury is removed for a lack of safeguarding, and the new one being put in, let's forget the other reasons, we'll get to those, has just a reckless record when it comes to safeguarding. This is actually preposterous.
So let me be pedantic and challenge your use of the word ironic. It isn't irony, it's corruption. It's corruption because there is administrative incompetence, which when it is addressed, the addressing of it is rebuffed and hidden. The obvious conclusion anyone has to come to is that the powers that be on the inside of the Church of England are absolutely determined they're going to make this woman Archbishop of Canterbury, and they won't accept any interference, any criticism, or any engagement with it. And now we're back to what I was saying earlier on. Although it's hearsay, the word on the street, the common sense of her competence is that she doesn't have any. So what on earth is the institution doing, promoting her to the highest office when she isn't competent? And the answer is, it's a triumph of feminist dogma over common sense and competent administration. So it's not just her who's incompetent in terms of safeguarding. The people who are ring fencing her and are refusing to accept any critique or criticism are also incompetent. Basically, it looks as though the institution is seriously dysfunctional.
Well, I think it's really appalling that one of the first things she said afterwards is she wants to confront misogyny, when this woman, first of all, I believe she was the chief nursing officer in England. So here's somebody who rose to the top in the secular world and ahead of everybody, was the chief nursing officer for years of England. Then she joins the church, I think it was back 2004 or something of that, and becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury, even though I think over 80% of the bishops are male. She rises above them, becomes the Archbishop. So now she's been in the top of the secular world and the top of the church. And the first thing she says is, we have a serious problem with misogyny.
The difficulty is that it isn't quite as straightforward as it seems. So although you've described her cosmetically rightly as having risen to the top of the nursing world, what's really happened is that there's a trade union to do with nursing. And she became a trade union official. So this is halfway between a politician and an administrator. She did rise to the top, but there's always an element of politics in terms of who makes it to the top of a trade union and how do they behave when they get there. The question is, she's either extremely clever, having risen to the top of both, or else she's extremely favored in the sense that she's got she's the protege of various people. The difficulty with rising to the top of the Church of England was that she doesn't really have a track record that suggests she got there by competence. Because first of all, it's been the case that people who've risen to the top of the Church of England have usually been theologically well educated. If you're going to be a bishop or an archbishop or a dean, it's presumed that you have a level of theological and intellectual competence and expertise, which means you've got at least an undergraduate degree, ideally 1 or 2 postgraduate degrees, preferably a PhD. The way she trained for the Church of England was part-time. She trained in night school. She did 2 evenings a week of theology for a couple of years. This is about as theology light as you could ever get. So then after doing theology light for a couple of evenings a week over a couple of years at night school, they ordained her, and then they rushed her through some fairly undemanding assistant clergy posts until they made her an assistant bishop. They left her there for a couple of years, and then, lo and behold, instantaneously, she became Bishop of London. It's hard to justify somebody who's got very little pastoral experience, picked this thing up as a kind of mid-career change, no qualifications for it, and a track record that's, you know, we would say politely say underwhelming. She hasn't got any qualifications for any of this. So then they made her Bishop of London. How has she done? Well, people think she's not done very well. Now they're going to make her Archbishop of Canterbury. I mean, it's hard to find the polite kind of language, really. You could only do that if the organization was seriously dysfunctional. They were absolutely determined to have a woman this time. The only other woman is a black Caribbean lady who is a fantastic demagogue with appalling judgment. And she would have been fun to have, because she would have been right there at the front to giving all the Church of England's money away for reparations. There was a very nice woman who looks like your great aunt, who's actually a Persian lady, who's a diocesan bishop, called something like Deftequani. I shouldn't try and pronounce her name. If you were going to have a bishop, she'd probably be the right, but she looks like a rather gentle grandmother that ought to have a bag of knitting quite close by. She doesn't quite have the persona of that you might expect with an archbishop. But basically, they had to choose between three women, and I think they chose the least problematic, but the most incompetent.
You know, what I was talking about with some people here in the United States is, you know, in the Anglican communion, and we wanted to ask about this, I've heard that 80% of the whole Anglican communion is against female priests. They don't want female priests. So now that the Archbishop of Canterbury is going to be a female, I know it's always been a bit of a tenuous hold of the Church of England being the head of the Anglican communion. Won't this be causing a huge rupture in that Anglican communion? I mean, what is the, for example, I read that Rwanda and Nigeria have declared spiritual independence now from the Church of England. The church is there, and multiple other countries. So what is the result of this, and what were they expecting the result of this to be?
If we go back a couple of steps and we say that the Vatican II battle that Catholics understand so well is being fought out amongst Anglicanism. So the Vatican II battle is essentially cultural modernity and progressive values being adopted by the church, which then swaps its Christian DNA for modern secular DNA. So the Church of England has been doing that for the same time as the Catholic Church has, but without a magisterium, without any central authority. The church, the Anglicans in England, in America, in Australia, have given way and very quickly adopted Western cultural values. I mean, we know what they do to society. They destroy working relationships between men and women. They destroy the family. They adopt a Marxist ideology of the equality of outcome. They promote gay blessings. They're behind transsexual rights, usually environmentally fundamentalist as well. The whole thing. But the Africans haven't gone down that route. They've said, actually, we're not at all convinced by this. And it just so happens that amongst the, let's say there are 80 million Anglicans in the world, it's probably a bit of an exaggeration, because they claim the whole of the population in Great Britain is Anglican. But the fact is, the majority of them, this 80%, come from Africa. And they say, we don't accept these values. And for the last 30 years, there's been fighting in the committee. And they've come to the end of their tether and said, you can count us out of the Anglican communion. We're not playing. We're absolutely not accepting, the games you play to continually disenfranchise us. We'd like to elect our own Archbishop for the Anglican communion. And you always insist on imposing the Archbishop of Canterbury, which had a historical mandate some time ago, but we're now asking you to drop the historical mandate and to take a more sensible democratic mandate. At this point, the progressives inside the Church of England stop being Democrats and they become colonialists when it suits them. So they've refused that. And so the Africans are right. They said, well, we're not playing. Now, if the rhetoric of consultation was remotely serious, not just in the liturgy, but in the Anglican communion, well, then you would say we can't have this person, because they're destroying the enterprise. The majority won't accept this person. The majority say clearly they won't accept Mullally, so they've decided ideologically to have a woman, this woman, destroy the Anglican communion, refuse any criticism, refuse any accountability, for the sake essentially of dogmatic feminism. So that gives you a sense we're not even dealing with Christian theology, Christian culture. We're dealing with a really hard-nosed version of secular fundamentalist ideology, which has crept in and taken the Church of England over. And that's one of the reasons why people like me, when we become Catholics, say, look, for goodness sake, however you work out the status of the Second Vatican Council, you mustn't go down this route of adopting secular progressive values, because the end is schism, relativism, and an evacuation of Christian culture and teaching. Don't do it.
Well, about 15 years ago, I remember I was spending some time in Liverpool, and I used to go see the Evensong at the Liverpool Cathedral. Wonderful cathedral, wonderful Evensong. And there was a marvelous priest over there, the Reverend Canon John Roberts. He was retired, but he used to come there in the evenings. And I remember he told me, I no longer wear my collar when I come down to the cathedral, because people sometimes will yell out at me or look at me strangely. He said, but this just changed, in the past few years. And he said that the culture, and this was 15 years ago, Canon John Roberts, wonderfully clever man, great sense of humor, traditionalist, told me that, and it really stuck in my mind, as here is a wonderful priest at Liverpool Cathedral, and he can no longer wear his collar walking through the streets of Liverpool. And he told me that the Church of England was fading, attendance was fading, and when I looked up recently, it said less than 1% in England, less than 1% attend weekly services. So is there really, this is making big news, but does the Church of England really have any relevance over there? Because to me, looking from the United States, it just seems like some woke social service organization. And I feel bad for great priests like Canon John Roberts and other ones I've met.
Well, you're right. It's in very serious decline. It has a great deal of money. It's got, actually, you could make an argument for saying it's Catholic money put into the central coffers from the Reformation and the sale of the monasteries onwards. But it's got an investment fund of, I think, about £10 billion. So what it can do is it can run the system without any people in it. And what we'll find is it has cathedrals, and it does large public events like royal weddings and royal funerals. So at the level of public choreography and public ritual, it will continue to operate. But it's disappearing and evaporating in the cities and in the countryside. And you're right, it's become a sociologically it deals in social work rather than spirituality, in politics rather than theology, and so no, it has no real relevance. Well, that's one of the reasons why I've been saying, as a relatively recent Catholic, the Catholics have been very badly marginalized by the system. This would be the time for the Catholic bishops to make their views known nationally, because there's a kind of vacuum. The Church of England bishops don't say much, and when they do, it's all political. What we really need is some people of competent, serious stature speaking to the British secular public about the virtues of Christianity. And since the Protestants have gone completely relative and political, only the Catholics are left. I think it's a Catholic duty to step into that vacuum, but it's very much countercultural given our history in the last 300 years.
I think what I end up wondering is, what on earth do these bishops in the Church of England think they're going to accomplish? And maybe the answer is they don't think they're going to accomplish anything. Maybe they're just committing suicide. But this new archbishop is not going to win awards, as you said, for theological training or skills. Certainly not for personality. And she does not seem competent in any way. She's going to probably cause a fracture. As we said, 80% of the communion doesn't even believe in female priests. So what is the purpose of getting her, or of electing her? You said they were hell-bent on electing a woman. There were 3 or 4 candidates. Is this ultimately suicide for the Church of England? Is this the end?
Well, so there's 2 questions there. Well, what are the consequences of what has happened? What has happened is that about 25 years ago, they put in a young feminist woman as appointment secretary. She was extremely competent. She trained. She did some theology at Oxford. She trained at a nationalized gas company where she went into HR and then moved from HR into the Church of England, where she was appointed this immensely influential position. She made it her business to bring in women bishops and to expel anybody who was likely to be uncomfortable with it. So although the new Bishop of London is against misogyny, this was androgyny, which was practiced, misanthropy, sorry. So that's what they've been doing for the last 30 years. And the answer was they would rather destroy the institution if they could, as long as they can win it for feminism, than not win it for feminism. And so that's what they've done. They've won it for feminism and they've destroyed the institution. Do they know that? Yes, I think they probably do, really. I think, but their prime value is this secular progressive ideology. It's the exchange of salvation for individuation or for political success. They don't care about salvation. They do care about egalitarianism, political success. So they don't mind destroying. They won't see the organization as destroyed. They'll see it as captured. And it doesn't matter how successful it is. They've captured it. That's what they set out to do. That's what matters. So yes, they intended it. They don't mind the consequences. They've achieved in political terms what they set out to achieve.
You know, I wonder, they have that $10 billion. Without that $10 billion, obviously this organization would be over in 2 weeks.
For sure.
Because they're completely incompetent. When you think of a business, you think of, they have to be quite competent. They have to attract people. They have to be relevant, or you're out of business. That's in capitalism, but they're holding on to that. But I wonder if the money does begin to dwindle in time and they unravel, what will be the future of all of those marvelous cathedrals, all of those buildings, all of those places? Is that something you think the Catholic Church can move back into? Is that what do you see as this church begins to unravel, or shall we say continues to unravel? What will happen to these billions of dollars in property and assets?
I don't know if our viewers are familiar with Douglas Murray. He's a significant English intellectual who wrote a seminal book called The Death of Europe about 10 years ago, essentially warning about the Islamicization of Europe. So, I mean, if you listen to Douglas Murray or J.D. Vance, the kind of quick and slightly facetious answer is, well, they'll become mosques. Because at the moment, we're in the grip of a very serious left-wing government that's beginning to use totalitarian politics to silence free speech and to attack Christianity. It will almost certainly give way. It'll almost certainly give way to a coalition which involves a greater Islamic political presence. It's very hard to imagine that the slow takeover of Christian cultural monuments by Islam won't continue. What would stop it? The reason I mentioned Douglas Murray is he was being interviewed the other day, and he said the difference between America and England is, in America there's hope. There's hope that in this progressive battle it can be turned round. There's hope that in the struggle between the red and the blue states, the red states might either survive or do better than survive. He said in England there doesn't seem to be any hope at all. The state is run by people who don't like the English. The state is run by people who are giving the English nation away. Our health service is. I was listening to somebody describe the casualty rooms in our hospitals, where I mean it was just simply awful. But the hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers are given private doctors, private medical health care. They're given a degree of medical supervision that the ordinary British citizen who's been paying taxes their whole life could only dream of. So this disparity is going to cause, obviously, some civil strife at some point. None of us know how it's going to work out. People like me have been trying to do what Douglas Murray has done, and to say, look, please don't go down this route. It's very serious. We get called, of course, bigoted, racist, Islamophobic. But the problem is we look like we've got to the point of no return. It's very difficult to know how we would return. And if we don't return, then the Church of England becomes an organization captured entirely by a hostile state, given a certain amount of permission to continue to coexist if they say and do the right things, or more importantly, avoid saying what the state considers the wrong things. What will the Catholic Church do at that point? Well, once again, I think it needs to behave in the way that it's always behaved where there's a totalitarian state, and do its best to confront it, if necessary, going underground. But I wish Douglas Murray is right. There doesn't seem to be any hope. I don't know what to say about turning it around or where one finds the hope.
Yeah, I was listening to a professor, Betts, talk about several lectures, excellent professor, talking several lectures. We can do that on a separate, there's a lot to talk about there, but talking about the possibilities of civil war in England. He has a lecture where he says it's already begun. He divides the society into the native working class British, and then on the other side are the elites, we'll put that in quotations, and Islam. And those sides, unfortunately, he says, have formed factions over there. As we view it here from the States, I remember, if you recall, J.D. Vance's infamous visit over there, where he said that England will become the first Muslim power with nuclear weapons. So, things we're hoping things can turn around, but when we hear things about the Church of England, the new Archbishop, these are not positive signs that they're headed in the right direction.
So Betts, as you quite rightly say, identifies 6 stages of civil war or civil disorder. He thinks we're at stage 4, which is on the edge of disorder and close to civil war. We don't know what will happen, but my own sense has been that the only way forward is likely to be some form of partition. The way in which the Muslims have organized how they live in this country is in large urban pockets which have become predominantly Muslim. And we know from what they've said to us that their aim is to establish independent Muslim pockets. And essentially what this means is a form of partition between Muslim areas of the country and non-Muslim areas of the country. The real difficulty for the indigenous British is that the longer civil disorder is delayed, the stronger the Islamic presence gets and the more leverage they have when it comes to partition. This makes it very difficult, because then the implication for that is that if you think this is bound to happen, it's in the interest of the local nation that civil disorder comes sooner rather than later, whilst the cards, if you like, are more stacked with the local population. But the moment you start talking like that, you become, of course, accused by the state of fomenting treason or disorder. And so one can't call for it publicly, but it seems to me an inevitable, but such an analysis seems to be an inevitable outcome of the facts as we see them at the moment.
And, here in the States, we all have a fascination with the king. As you know, the prince is frolicking around Malibu and those areas as we speak, hanging out with Oprah Winfrey and such. But the king, as we know here, is the head of the Church of England. What is his take on all of this? Where is he standing? Because it seems every time I check the news, he's at another Islamic celebration or Muslim celebration or doing something else. I never see him at a Christian event. I don't ever see him doing anything regards to Christianity. And I don't know if I'm clicking on the wrong button on YouTube, but I've never seen him do anything in terms of that. And as a defender of the faith, I think the defender might be, replaced with a destructor of the faith. But what is your take on that?
Well, you can give him credit for being consistent. He's said the same thing for the last 30 years. So we can't be accused of misunderstanding him. First of all, he tried single-handedly to redefine his constitutional commitments. Instead of being defender of the Protestant faith, which is what the title requires, he's said for some time, I'd like to interpret this differently and become defender of faiths. Now, somebody should have said, you can't become king on that basis. A bit like objecting to Sarah Mullally as Archbishop. We should have objected to Charles becoming king and said, you need to retract your pluralism and your relativism if you can't take this oath. So he took the oath in one form, but he clearly meant something else. Well, that's very difficult. What is his status as king if he's forsworn himself in the coronation ceremony by using one set of words but meaning something else because he said he meant something else for a very long time and he hasn't rescinded that? And that's how he's acting out. So many people have said, well, you're king in name only, or you're not my king. Or he's lost the goodwill, I would say, of most of the country, who see him as a sort of WEF, Davos supporting member of the elite with strong Islamic sympathies. In what sense is he king of the English? In only a cosmetic sense is the answer.
Well, I can say here from the States, we're all always rooting for England and the UK. That's just the way it is. There's a natural affinity on both sides of the pond, I would say. So we're hoping some solutions, emerge. There's a lot of people thinking about this, coming up with ideas. You paint a rather bleak picture, but probably accurately. But hopefully some light comes at the end of this tunnel and there is some way out. And I think next week we should talk a little bit more about this idea of civil war, what Professor Betts is talking about. I think that could be very interesting for our viewers.
I'd just like to say that this is not confined to England. Essentially, this is a European problem. Europe as a whole has given way. One of the things that Bishop Schneider has said very clearly, and I think very helpfully in the last month, is that the mass migration is quite clearly a strategy driven by the elites to de-Christianize Europe. It's being driven by money and power. It's not entirely sure who's in control of them, whose money and whose power it is, but we can certainly see the outcome. And so it's simply worked faster in England in many ways and other places. But it's a Europe-wide problem. And so I don't want to be seen as being particularly negative in terms of my own backyard. I think as a Christian, I'd say, I take a global view and say that you would have thought 50 years ago that the countries behind the Iron Curtain were finished with Christianity forever. And I think the number of population who identified as Christians was less than 1% in the Soviet Union. That was the case in 1989. By about the year 2010, 1% had turned to 69%. There was this extraordinary change in the Soviet Union. Now, I mean, I'm not forecasting, but I think what we have to say is that God is not a nationalist. At least he might like nations because he created them that way, but he doesn't identify with any particular nation anymore, or at all. And therefore, it's a tragedy if Europe abandons its Christian heritage. But faith in Jesus is growing in Africa. It's growing in China. It's growing in Russia. It's only in Europe that it's really having a very bad time. It's where industrialized progressivism is at its worst. America hangs in the balance, I think, but there is hope in America. So perhaps one should say to the Americans, well, look at Europe before you give up on your own values and look what happens. Although, to be honest, you've got those examples in the blue states, I think. So I think one of the reasons why there is hope in America, It's because you are a federal system where you can choose between your values, and consequently, the safe, holistic Christian cultures in the red states are likely to flourish as places where people want to live. They partly want to live there because the people who run, the politicians who run it, do so with values that allow the maximum, even in Benthamite terms, the maximum human flourishing in terms of taxes and income and freedom and so on. So I think America has reasons for hope. The real problem is with Europe. But there again, I think one of the things I'd want to say, and this is going to sound a bit extravagant, but I think I mentioned before that I was at a meeting about it 9 months ago where one of Trump's former national security advisors came in. And I was being slightly provocative, but I said, I wouldn't want your experiences in Vietnam to preclude you trying to do the same thing again on principle. So in Vietnam, you saw a dogmatic left-wing move of communism, threatened democracy and totality, and you invested American troops in trying to keep a cordon sanitaire of democratic freedom. Well, you might want to think of doing the same thing again in Europe this time, because without American intervention, we really are cooked. So I don't know if we have J.D. Vance as a member of our audience yet, but if we did, I can't see any other alternative. I'd like that view to make its way into the White House, whether or not it was looked on with favor at some stage. But essentially, if you don't help us, nobody can.
Well, on that note, let's explore that more next week. These are very interesting subjects. I think our audience is going to want to hear more about that. And let's touch on that again when we meet next. Okay, Gavin. Well, it's been a pleasure, as always.
We need a joke or a happy statistic.
Yes. Well, I will say this, Gavin, though, there is enthusiasm. I think I read that Bible sales in England are up 124% in England. That's a pretty large increase. So the fact that there's, and they said they're across all age ranges. So the fact that Bible sales are up 124% is a good sign. I'm not saying it's a deal breaker, but let's start with that, and we'll see. At least the Bible owning companies are doing well. So let's start with that as a positive sign.
I think it's an unmitigated triumph we should cling on to as a sign of hope for the future. Yes, absolutely. Hooray. Wonderful. What a great note to end on. Thank you.
Okay. God bless, Gavin. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Justin.